You have exactly 20 minutes to sign this resignation, or we will initiate a formal termination for cause, effective immediately. Those were the words that echoed in the silence of the top floor executive suite. After 22 years of building that company from the ground up, after surviving 3 economic recessions and 4 different CEOs, I was being given less time than a lunch break to decide the fate of my entire career. I looked at the man across the table, a 30-something Ivy League graduate who had been with the firm for less than 6 months, and I realized he wasn't just firing me, he was trying to erase me. I chose to resign, but I didn't sign their document. I walked over to the corner desk, took a fresh sheet of company letterhead, and wrote a single, carefully crafted sentence. I signed it with my full legal name, handed it to them, and walked out without taking a single box. 5 days later, at exactly 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, my phone began to vibrate on my nightstand. It was the firm's chief legal counsel, and he sounded like he was hyperventilating. "Ms. Vance," he stammered, his voice thin and panicked. "We need to discuss the specific phrasing of your exit letter. We seem to have a significant structural problem." I sat up, took a slow sip of water, and smiled. I knew exactly what he was talking about. I had left them a ticking time bomb wrapped in professional courtesy, and it had just gone off in the middle of their boardroom. But to understand how a single sentence could bring a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate to its knees, I have to take you back to the beginning. I have to show you the 22 years of blueprints, the secret archives, and the absolute arrogance of men who think experience is a liability. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 47 years old, and until recently, I was the executive vice president of global logistics at Meridian Tech Solutions. Meridian isn't a household name, but if you've ever used a high-end medical imaging device or a precision aerospace component, there's a 90% chance the software and hardware integration that makes it work was managed by my department. I started there in the spring of 2003. I was 25, fresh out of my master's program, and I started as a data entry clerk in the warehouse. Back then, Meridian was a 40-person operation working out of a converted garage in the suburbs of Seattle. By the time the fall of 2025 rolled around, I was overseeing a division of 400 people across 5 time zones. My annual salary was $215, not including a performance-based bonus structure that usually added another $60,000 to $80,000 a year. I had stock options that had matured over 2 decades, a comprehensive executive pension plan, and more institutional knowledge than the company's entire server farm. I was the person who knew why the 2008 contract with the Singapore suppliers had a specific act of God clause that saved us during the pandemic. I was the person who remembered the private cell phone number of the head of customs in Rotterdam. I was the bridge between the old world way of doing business and the digital frontier. But in late 2024, the tides shifted. Meridian was acquired in a hostile takeover by a private equity firm called Stratos Global Capital. Stratos didn't care about precision or long-term relationships. They cared about trimming the fat. In the world of private equity, fat is often code for anyone with a high salary and enough experience to know when they're being lied to. The new leadership arrived in January 2025. They were led by Julian Thorne, the new CEO. Julian was 34, wore $4,000 suits, and spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and lean optimization. Along with him came Marcus Sterling, the CFO, a man who viewed humans as rounding errors on a balance sheet. They didn't see a woman who had spent half her life building a legacy. They saw a line item that cost the company nearly $300,000 a year in total compensation. I saw the writing on the wall from the first week. They began replacing senior directors with 24-year-old analysts who had never seen a shipping container in real life, but were very good at making PowerPoints. They were cutting corners on safety protocols and alienating vendors we had worked with for 20 years. I knew I was next, but unlike the younger staff who were being ushered out with 2 weeks of pay and a handshake, I had a contract. And more importantly, I had a memory. Starting in February, I began what I called my insurance policy. Every single night after the office went quiet, I stayed late. I wasn't just doing my job, I was documenting the systematic dismantling of the company. I saved every email where Marcus told me to ignore the fine print on labor laws. I archived every memo where Julian discussed the phasing out of legacy personnel based on their age and compensation. I also made sure I had copies of every contract I had ever negotiated, especially the ones with the change of control clauses that the new legal team had clearly neglected to read. I kept all of this on 3 encrypted drives. One was in a safe deposit box, one was with my attorney, a brilliant woman named Clara Whitmore, and one was buried in a flower pot on my back porch. I was prepared for a war of attrition, but the efficiency squad, as we called them, was too impatient for that. They wanted me gone before the Q3 earnings call so they could show the board how much they had optimized. The executive payroll. The ambush happened on a rainy Friday in October. I was called to the Blue Room, the most formal conference room in the building, at 40 p.m. When I walked in, I saw the quartet of doom: Julian, Marcus, Silas, and a very nervous-looking HR representative named Sarah. There was no small talk. No, thank you for your 2 decades of service. Julian didn't even look up from his tablet. He just pushed a folder toward me. Alana, he said, his voice flat and rehearsed, as part of our Meridian 2.0 initiative, we are realigning our leadership structure. Your role has been identified as redundant under our new automated logistics framework. We're offering you a voluntary resignation package. If you sign now, you'll receive 4 weeks of severance, and we will provide a neutral reference. If you refuse, we will move to immediate termination for performance issues, which we've documented over the last quarter. I almost laughed. Performance issues. I had received the Executive Excellence Award 6 months prior. I looked at the resignation document. It was a standard, shut up and go away agreement. By signing it, I would be waiving my right to sue for age discrimination, giving up my matured stock options, and forfeiting my right to the change of control bonus that was triggered when Stratos bought the company. 4 weeks of severance? I asked quietly. After 22 years. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes cold. It's a generous offer, Elena, considering the current market, and quite frankly, your refusal to adapt to our new software systems has been noted. We could make this very difficult for you. You have 20 minutes. They left the room to give me privacy, which was really just a tactic to let the fear sink in. But I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I reached into my bag and pulled out a pen, the one the original founder of the company had given me when I made director. I didn't touch their folder. Instead, I took a sheet of paper from the credenza and wrote, I, Elena Vance, hereby submit my resignation as Executive Vice President, contingent upon the full and verified liquidation of all contractual obligations, deferred compensation, and statutory entitlements as defined by the 2018 Executive Charter and applicable labor laws. I signed it, walked to the door, and signaled them back in. I handed the paper to Julian. He glanced at it, saw the word resignation, and let out a sigh of relief. He didn't read the middle part. He didn't care about the phrasing. He just saw a win. Wise choice, he said, offering a hand I didn't take. Sarah will process your final check. Please have your desk cleared by 50 p.m. I walked out of that building with my head held high, carrying only my purse. I didn't need the files. I already had them. I didn't need the desk. It was just wood. What I had was that one sentence. The weekend was quiet. I spent it in my garden, pruning roses and drinking tea with Clara, my lawyer. She read the copy of the note I'd sent her and chuckled. You realize they're going to have a stroke when they realize what contingent upon full liquidation actually means in the context of your 2018 contract, right? That's the plan, Clara, I said. They wanted me to resign, I did. Now they just have to pay the entry fee for my departure. Monday passed in total silence. I imagined them high-fiving in the boardroom, telling themselves how easily they'd handled the old guard. But Tuesday morning, the clock ran out. My 2018 contract, the one I had negotiated when the company was at its peak, contained a very specific golden parachute clause. It stated that if I resigned due to a material change in my job description following a change in ownership, the company was required to pay out 3 years of my highest salary, all remaining stock options at the current market value, and a 24-month consulting retainer. But there was a catch, one I had added myself back then. If the company accepted a resignation that was contingent on those payments, they weren't just agreeing to pay me, they were agreeing that the resignation wasn't final until the money hit my account. And because I hadn't officially resigned until the payment was made, I was still, technically, an employee who was currently being denied access to her office, which constituted a breach of contract and triggered an additional 20% penalty. The phone call at 6:42 a.m. from the chief counsel, a man named Arthur, was just the beginning. "Alana," Arthur said, his voice now a frantic whisper, "I'm looking at your 2018 charter, and I'm looking at this note you gave Julian. Do you realize that by accepting this contingent resignation, the CEO essentially signed a check for nearly $2 million. Actually, Arthur," I replied, leaning back against my headboard, "if you factor in the 20% penalty for the lockout, the matured stock options at the Monday morning opening price, and the 24-month retainer at my EVP rate, the number is closer to $2.85 million. And since I'm still technically on the payroll until that money is liquidated, I believe I'm also accruing my daily rate of $826 per day." There was a long, hollow silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Arthur's career flashing before his eyes. He wasn't in the room when they bullied me. He was just the one who had to clean up the mess. Julian is not going to approve this," Arthur said. "Then Julian is choosing to keep me as an employee," I said, "in which case I expect my remote access to the server to be restored by 9 a.m., and I'll be expecting an apology for the performance issue comments in the meeting. Otherwise, my attorney will be filing a formal age discrimination suit with the EEO am. I have the recordings, Arthur. I have the emails." "Recordings?" Arthur choked out. "Colorado is a one-party consent state, Arthur. And I never go into a termination meeting without a digital recorder in my pocket." Julian's comments about legacy personnel and clearing out the expensive old wood are quite clear. I imagine the board of Stratos Global would love to hear how their CEO is creating a massive liability for the firm. The line went dead. An hour later, Marcus Sterling, the CFO, tried to call me. I didn't answer. He sent a text, "Elena, let's be reasonable. We can offer you 6 months of pay. That's more than anyone else got." I didn't reply. I sent a screenshot of the text to Clara. She replied with a smiley face and a "keep waiting." By Wednesday, the panic had moved up the chain. Apparently, word had reached the board of Stratos Global. They were in the middle of a delicate merger with another tech firm, and the last thing they needed was a high-profile executive suing them for millions while holding recordings of their CEO making discriminatory remarks. At 20:15 p.m. on Thursday, I received a calendar invite for a Zoom call. The participants were the chairman of the board of Stratos, the entire legal team, and a very quiet, very pale Julian Thorne. The chairman, a man who sounded like he had been born in a boardroom, spoke first. "Ms. Vance, it seems there has been a catastrophic misunderstanding regarding your transition from the company. We've reviewed your 2018 contract and your resignation note. While we find the language of your note to be highly strategic, we recognize that it was accepted by our CEO." He paused, and I could practically feel him glaring at Julian through the screen. "We are prepared to settle this matter immediately," the chairman continued. "We will liquidate all contractual obligations as defined in your 2018 charter. We will also pay out the consulting retainer as a lump sum. In exchange, you will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a mutual non-disparagement clause, and your recordings you may have." "I have a counter-offer," I said, my voice steady. "The settlement amount is non-negotiable. $2.85 million. But I also want a formal letter of recommendation signed by Julian, stating that my departure was a huge loss to the company and that my performance was exemplary. And I want a written apology sent to my former team, acknowledging that the realignment was a corporate decision and had nothing to do with the quality of my leadership. Julian looked like he wanted to scream. Marcus was staring at his shoes. That's a lot to ask, Elena, the chairman said. It's a lot less than the damage a public discrimination lawsuit will do to your merger. I countered. And every hour we spend talking about this, my daily rate continues to accrue. I'm an expensive employee to keep around for doing nothing, don't you think? There was a muffled conversation on their end. 2 minutes later, the chairman came back on. Agreed. The documents will be in your inbox in an hour. The wire transfer will be initiated once the NDA is signed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just felt a deep sense of justice. I had spent 22 years giving my life to that company, and I wasn't going to let a group of tourists in suits treat me like a disposable asset. The money hit my account on Friday afternoon, 254,000. It was more than enough to retire, more than enough to travel, and more than enough to fund a small consulting firm of my own. I signed the final papers, sent a copy of my recordings to Clara for safekeeping, and finally deleted my work email from my phone. But the story didn't end there. 6 months later, I was sitting on a beach in Portugal when my phone buzzed. It was an old colleague from Meridian. "Elena, you won't believe it," she said, her voice giddy with excitement. "Julian and Marcus are gone. The board fired them both last week." "What happened?" I asked. "The merger fell through. When the other company did their due diligence, they found a complete mess in the logistics department. Apparently, after you left, the whole system collapsed. They lost 3 of our biggest contracts because nobody knew how to navigate the international shipping regulations you used to handle. The automated framework they spent millions on turned out to be a disaster. The company lost $40 million in a single quarter." I took a sip of my wine and looked out at the ocean. I wasn't surprised. You can buy a company, you can buy the hardware, and you can buy the brand name, but you can't buy 22 years of experience, and you certainly can't replace it with a PowerPoint presentation. "And there's more," my friend continued. "The board is looking for someone to come back as an outside consultant to fix the mess. They're offering a ridiculous hourly rate. Everyone's saying they're going to call you." I smiled, feeling the warm sun on my face. "They can call," I said, "but my hourly rate just tripled. And tell them. The first thing I'll need is a very, very long vacation." I hung up the phone and watched the waves. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't thinking about shipping schedules, vendor contracts, or corporate politics. I was thinking about the flowers I was going to plant in my new garden. I was thinking about the books I was finally going to read. And I was thinking about my father, who always told me, "The most powerful thing you can ever own is your own name. Don't let anyone put a price on it unless it's the price you set." I had set my price, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally worth every penny. As I sat there, the sound of the Atlantic Ocean providing a much better soundtrack than any boardroom hum, I began to reflect on the hundreds of people I had worked with over the years. I thought of the interns I had mentored who were now directors themselves, and the warehouse foremen who had become my friends. I realized that my revenge wasn't just about the money. It was about proving a point for all of them. In the modern corporate world, there is a dangerous myth that youth equals innovation and that experience equals obsolescence. They think they can download a company's soul into an algorithm and fire the people who built it. But they forgot that an algorithm can't negotiate a late night deal in a foreign port. An algorithm doesn't know when a supplier is lying to you because of the tone of their voice, and an algorithm certainly doesn't have the grit to stand up to a bully when everything is on the line. I took out my laptop and started a new document. I wasn't writing a logistics plan this time. I was writing a guide a handbook for the legacy personnel who were still in the trenches. I called it the one-sentence resignation. I wanted every person who had given 20 years of their life to a company to know that they have more power than they think. I wanted them to know that their history isn't a burden, it's armor. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and fire. It looked a lot like the orange glow of a Colorado sunset, the kind I used to watch from my office window at Meridian. But this time, I wasn't staying late to fix someone else's mistake. I was staying late because I was exactly where I wanted to be. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a LinkedIn notification. Julian Thorne had updated his profile. He was now looking for opportunities. I couldn't help it, I chuckled. I hope he finds one. And I hope he remembers to read the fine print next time. Because in the end, the world doesn't belong to the loudest people in the room, or the ones with the flashiest titles. It belongs to the people who do the work, who keep the records, and who know exactly what they're worth. It belongs to the people who realize that sometimes the best way to move forward is to write your own ending. And my ending, it's just getting started. The days in Portugal turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. I traveled through the small coastal towns, eating fresh sardines and drinking wine that cost €5 but tasted like a miracle. My mind, which had been a whirlwind of logistics and numbers for 2 decades, finally began to slow down. I noticed things I had been too busy to see before, the way the light changed on the white, washed walls at noon, the specific rhythm of the local markets, and the incredible peace of a morning where the only thing on my list was a walk on the beach. But even in the quiet, the echoes of my old life would find me. I received messages from former colleagues who were being restructured, out of their jobs. They were scared, confused, and felt like they were being tossed aside like yesterday's news. I started spending my afternoons at a small cafe with a view of the harbor, replying to their messages. I didn't just give them legal advice, I gave them back their dignity. You aren't your job title. I told a former director of procurement who had been with the company for 18 years. You are the person who managed a $40 million budget through a global crisis. That skill set doesn't vanish just because a 30-year-old with a shiny MBA says so. Document your wins, know your contract, and never, ever let them see you blink. I began to realize that my one-sentence resignation had become something of a legend in the industry. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the shift in power. People were starting to realize that institutional knowledge was the most valuable asset a company had. And if you treated it like garbage, it would eventually cost you everything. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman I didn't know. Her name was Maya, and she was the CEO of a mid-sized tech firm in Austin, Texas. She had heard my story through the grapevine and wanted to talk. Elena, the email read, I've seen what happened at Meridian since you left. It's a tragedy of mismanagement, but it's also a lesson. I'm looking for someone to join our board of directors, not to manage logistics, but to manage our culture. I want someone who understands that the people who built the company are the ones who will save it. Are you interested? I looked out at the fishing boats returning to the harbor. A year ago, I would have jumped at the chance. I would have seen it as a way to prove my worth all over again. But now I didn't feel like I had anything left to prove. I typed back a short reply, Maya, thank you for the offer. I'm honored. But right now, I'm busy growing a garden. However, I'd be happy to consult for you 4 hours a week, remotely from my porch in Portugal. My rate is high, but my advice is ironclad. And the first rule of my consultancy is this: never fire the person who knows where the bodies are buried. She replied within 10 minutes. Deal. And just like that, I had a new career. One that I controlled. One that respected my time and my experience. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was a guardian of the hold guard. I was the person who helped companies avoid the mistakes Julian and Marcus had made. As the months passed, Meridian Tech Solutions continued to struggle. Stratos Global Capital eventually sold it off at a massive loss to a competitor. The new owners reached out to me, offering me a massive salary to come back and lead the turnaround. I declined. I told them I could recommend 3 people who were currently looking for opportunities. Because Stratos had fired them, people with 15+ years of experience who knew the company better than anyone. Hire them, I told the new owners. Pay them what they're worth, and then get out of their way. They did, and slowly the company began to heal. I eventually moved back to the States, but not to Seattle. I bought a small farm in the mountains of Colorado, not far from where my father had lived. I spent my days in the dirt, planting things that would outlast me. I built a greenhouse that used the same precision logistics I had used at Meridian. But instead of aerospace components, I was managing heirloom tomatoes and rare orchids. I was 48 now, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in the prime of my life. I was healthy, I was wealthy, and I was free. I had a small group of consulting clients who valued my brain more than my hours, and I had a community of legacy professionals who checked in on each other, shared legal tips, and celebrated each other's wins. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the Rockies. I had a glass of wine in one hand and a book in the other. My phone chimed with a news alert. Julian Thorne had been named in a lawsuit by his new employer for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I didn't feel a surge of spite. I just felt a quiet, satisfied sense of irony. The world has a way of balancing itself out, eventually. It just takes someone with a little bit of patience and a very sharp pen to help it along. I thought back to that Friday afternoon in the Blue Room. I thought about the fear I had felt for a split second before I realized my own power. I thought about the look on Julian's face when he saw that I had resigned on my own terms. I realized then that the one sentence wasn't just a legal trap. It was a declaration of independence. It was the moment I stopped being a cog in someone else's machine and became the architect of my own life. I looked down at my hands that were stained with soil from my garden, not ink from a corporate printer. They were the hands of a woman who had worked hard, who had fought fair, and who had won. I picked up my pen and wrote one last thing in my journal, a final thought for anyone who might ever find themselves in a room with 4 men in suits and 20 minutes to decide their future. They will tell you that you are replaceable. They will tell you that the world has moved on. They will tell you that your time is up. But remember this, they only say those things because they are afraid of what happens when you finally realize you don't need them. You are the archive. You are the architect. And you are the only one who gets to sign your name to the final chapter. I closed the journal, took a sip of my wine, and watched the stars come out. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a good night, it was a beautiful night, and best of all, it was mine. The story of Anna Vaughn, or Alina Vance, as I chose to be known, isn't just a story about a corporate settlement. It's a story about the enduring value of a human being in a world that tries to turn everything into data. It's a reminder that even when the systems change and the logos are rebranded, the truth remains: you cannot automate wisdom. You cannot outsource integrity. And you should never, ever underestimate a woman who knows her own history. As I sat there, a cool breeze ruffled the pages of my journal. I thought about the thousands of other people out there, right now, sitting in similar conference rooms, facing similar threats. I wished I could whisper to all of them, don't sign. Not yet. Write your own sentence. And then, wait for the call. Because the call always comes. And when it does, make sure you're the one holding the line. The fire in the hearth crackled, and I felt a deep, warm contentment. The garden was sleeping, the stars were bright, and for the first time in 22 years, I didn't have to check my email. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And the silence was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. As I reflect on the years that followed my departure from Meridian Tech, the landscape of my life transformed in ways I could never have predicted. My small farm in Colorado became more than just a place to grow vegetables. It became a hub for a new kind of movement. I started hosting retreats for the reclaimed, gatherings for professionals who had been pushed out of their industries after decades of service. We didn't just talk about logistics or finance. We talked about the psychological toll of corporate betrayal and how to build a life that wasn't dependent on a company's approval. I saw engineers who had been told they were too old to innovate start building sustainable housing projects. I saw marketing experts who were out of touch create grassroots campaigns for local nonprofits that went viral overnight. We were a community of ghosts who had decided to stop being invisible. And in the center of it all was the lesson I had learned. Your value is not what someone is willing to pay you. It's what you know you're worth when the paycheck stops. I remember one autumn evening, about 3 years after the settlement, I was sitting around a large stone fire pit with a group of these ghosts. One man, a former CFO of a major airline who had been let go after 30 years, looked at me and asked, "Alana, do you ever regret it? Do you ever miss the rush of the big deals, the global scale, the feeling of being at the center of the world?" I looked at the flames and then up at the dark, expansive Colorado sky. I miss the people, I said honestly. I miss the collective energy of a team solving a hard problem. But the rush, no. I found a different kind of rush. The rush of waking up and knowing that my time belongs entirely to me. The rush of planting a seed and knowing exactly how to help it grow. I'm still at the center of my world. It's just a world that I built, not one I'm renting from a private equity firm. He nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said. "It's not about the size of the garden. It's about who owns the gate." Exactly. In the final accounting of a life, the numbers on a wire transfer are just symbols. The $285 million was a tool. It bought me time, it bought me space, and it bought me the ability to say no. But the real victory was the phone call at 6:42 a.m. The victory was the moment the bullies realized they couldn't bully me anymore. The victory was the realization that after 22 years, I wasn't the one who was lost. They were. As I grew older, I became less of a consultant and more of a storyteller. I wrote a book about the invisibles, the people who keep the world running while the disruptors take the credit. It became a bestseller, not because it was a business book, but because it was a human book. It struck a chord with a generation of workers who were tired of being treated like hardware that needed an upgrade. I traveled the world, not for business, but for curiosity. I went back to Portugal, to the small cafe by the harbor, and bought a round of drinks for the fishermen. I went to Japan and learned about the art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold, making the scars the most beautiful part of the object. I realized that my own career was a piece of kintsugi. The break at Meridian hadn't destroyed me. It had allowed me to be put back together in a way that was stronger and more valuable than before. One day, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a simple white envelope. Inside was a clipping from a business journal. It was an article about the total collapse of Stratos Global Capital. They had been investigated for a series of fraudulent efficiency measures that turned out to be nothing more than illegal labor practices and accounting tricks. Julian Thorne's name was mentioned as a key figure in the investigation. I didn't feel joy at his downfall. I just felt a sense of closure. The efficiency squad had finally met an efficiency they couldn't outrun the truth. I put the clipping in a small wooden box where I kept my mementos, the pen from the founder, the photo of my first day at the warehouse, and the original copy of my one-sentence resignation. I realized that box was my real treasure. It wasn't full of money, it was full of proof. Proof that I existed, that I mattered, and that I had stayed true to myself when it counted. I'm 70 now. My hair is white, my hands are weathered, and I spend most of my days in my greenhouse. My daughter, who followed in my footsteps and is now a brilliant advocate for workers' rights, came to visit me last week. She sat with me on the porch watching the sun go down. "Mom," she said, "are you ever going to tell the whole story? The parts you left out of the book? The names, the dates, the specific way you outplayed them?" I smiled and took a sip of my tea. "The names and dates don't matter anymore, honey. The specific tactics are outdated. What matters is the feeling. The feeling of knowing that you have a choice. I want people to remember that. I want them to know that no matter how big the company is, or how powerful the people in the room seem, they are just people. And people can be outsmarted by anyone who knows how to wait and how to write." She laughed and leaned against my shoulder. "You're still a legend, you know. They still talk about the Vance Clause in contract law classes." "Is that so?" I chuckled. "Well, I hope they teach them that the clause only works if you have the guts to use it." As the night settled in, I felt a familiar sense of peace. The garden was quiet, the mountains were dark, and my heart was full. I had lived a long life, a hard life, and a good life. I had built things that lasted, and I had walked away when they no longer served the truth. I had loved, I had fought, and I had grown. And in the end, that's all a garden really is. A place where you plant, where you tend, and where you eventually let go so that something else can take root. I am Alina Vance. I was a clerk, I was a director, I was an executive, and I was a legacy. But today I am simply a woman who is content, and that in the world of corporate giants and private equity pirates is the greatest victory of all. If you are listening to this, and you are feeling the walls close in, remember my story. Remember that 20 minutes is not a lifetime. Remember that a single sentence can change everything. And most importantly, remember that the person across the table doesn't own your value. You do. Now, if you'll excuse me, the moon is out, the crickets are singing, and I have a few more pages of my journal to write. There's a new season starting soon, and I want to be ready for the first bloom. The legacy of Meridian Tech might be gone, but the legacy of the woman who refused to be erased is still growing. And it's a beautiful thing to see. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool mountain air wash over me. I thought of the millions of people who wake up every day and head into offices, warehouses, and factories. I thought of the quiet pride in a job well done and the hidden strength in those who have seen it all. I smiled, knowing that the invisibles are never truly invisible. We are the foundation. We are the architects. And as long as we remember our worth, the world will always find its way back to the light. Good night, and may your own garden always be in bloom. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but the warmth remained. I stood up, my joints slightly stiff but my spirit light, and walked inside. I passed the mirror in the hallway and caught a glimpse of my reflection. I saw the lines around my eyes, the maps of every laugh and every crisis I had managed. I saw the steady gaze of a woman who had no more secrets to keep and no more battles to win. I went to my desk and picked up my favorite fountain pen. I opened a fresh page in my ledger, not for logistics but for life. I wrote 3 words at the very top of the page, words that had become my mantra in these later years. Still, here, growing. And as I turned out the lamp, the darkness wasn't empty. It was full of the future, a future I had fought for, a future I had earned, and a future that was, finally, entirely my own. The story of the one-sentence resignation was never really about the resignation at all. It was about the moment I decided that my life was worth more than a paycheck. It was about the realization that the most important contract I would ever sign was the one I made with myself, to never be smaller than I am, and to never let anyone else hold the pen to my story. And so, as the world outside continues to rush and disrupt, I remain here, in my garden, in my mountains, in my peace. I am the legacy, I am the archive, and I am, most importantly, free. The end of one story is always just the soil for the next, and I can't wait to see what grows tomorrow.